Thank you for everybody who's joined us this evening. And I don't know if what your particular interest is in fertility astrology, but I'm sure you would have realized while searching through all the astrological texts that there isn't a lot of material related to fertility. And it's very difficult to get a handle on a cohesive structure or a cohesive kind of way into a chart to answer the question of when will I have children, or will I have children with this person, or does my chart say anything about having children? And as modern astrologers, that's where I started with modern astrology. We kind of only have one tool in our handbag, and that is the ruler of the fifth house. So a lot of people will go straight to the ruler of the fifth house and describe the contents of the fifth house, aspects to the fifth house, and that's kind of all that that's really out there in the mainstream texts. And it's a great place to start. The fifth house is not the fifth house for nothing, but it's not the whole story. So back in the day, and when I say back in the day, this is when the three Roberts were translating the Project Hindsight material. I came across a photocopied little book translated by Robert Hand called Omar of Tiburas, the Book of Nativities. And this book introduced me to Almutens, and particularly the Almuten of Pregnancy. And it was a particular philosophy and a way of thinking about different kinds of topics that intrigued me, because it kind of brought more to the table, and it kind of just went a little bit deeper than the ruler of the fifth house. So that's kind of where I started with my way of appreciating how to find fertility in the chart. The material that we're going to talk about today, and particularly the calculation of the Almuten of Pregnancy, is available directly from my book. In fact, there's a work table at the back. So if you do have my book, feel free to go right to the back, and there is a table, and you can start filling it in with your own details right now. And we're going to be talking about, I'm going to teach you how to calculate the Almuten of Pregnancy using Amanda's chart. Amanda is the first chart interpretation chapter in the book. We're going to use Amanda's chart to calculate the Almuten of Pregnancy, and then I'm going to talk to you about Lyndall and Dennis. So let's first understand what I mean exactly by an Almuten of Pregnancy. So an Almuten is an algorithm. It's a list of sums. It's like adding up the power of a planet in a certain place or in a certain degree. It's Arabic in origin, and it is entirely dependent on knowledge of essential dignity. So we are using traditional planets, and we cannot use Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune, obviously, because according to traditional rules, they don't rule anything. Deborah Holding of SkyScript has wonderful material on Almutens and the Arabic Almuten, meaning and her interpretation was meaning the firm one or a strong one in power. But if you go and look up Almutens on her site, you'll get more of an understanding that they're not only used with pregnancy, they're used for everything. Omar of Tiburas's book was the definitive one on the Almuten of Pregnancy, but Guido Bonatti also used Almutens to calculate things like professions. So when you open up Solar Fire, sometimes you'll see that there's an Almuten or medieval page, and there's a whole list of Almutens. Those are all compound Almutens, meaning that they take many places in the chart into consideration. Through the process of dignity and rulership, they determine which planet has the most power or the most strength over the topic that you're inquiring about. A funny thing about Almutens is that you could actually make up your own Almuten. So you could make up an Almuten of red hair, if you like, and you could have Aries as one of the points, where 0 degrees of Aries in your chart. You could have Saturn could be taken into consideration, and perhaps the moon for complexion. So these Almutens are you can stretch the traditional rule in order to make up Almutens for just about everything. So that's just a brief introduction to the Almuten and how it can be useful, but it's better to show you in practice. So let's go ahead. And we look at what Omar was looking at in order to create his Almuten of Pregnancy. So he kind of thought, well, it's not just enough to use the fifth house cusp, although that is a very important place, but you actually need you need a good physical body. You need physical health. So then he decided, well, the physical health is seen by the ascendant. So he said, okay, so now we're going to take the degree of the ascendant. So whatever your degree of your ascendant is, you write that down. So mine's 21 of Pisces, you write down 21 of Pisces as the ascendant. Then it's the ruler of the ascendant. So then we need to go to what rules that ascendant, and then we find them in the chart and we go, okay, what degree is that ruler of ascendant at? And that kind of deals with your health. And then obviously the moon in a person's chart has a lot to do with nurturing and the experience of being nurtured, but also children. So we want to have a look at the degree of the moon, the ruler of the moon. And here we are back at also using the fifth house cusp, and the ruler of the fifth house cusp. Where is that in the chart, and what dignity does that planet have? And then he says we've got to rely on luck. So Omar says by taking the position of Jupiter into consideration, we are assessing somebody's ability to access good luck, or somebody's ability to kind of receive blessings. So we'll take the position of Jupiter into account. And then this is the tricky part, and this is why you'll never see the Almuten of Pregnancy in a solar fire chart description yet, is because once you've done all of this, you then have to see, is there a planet in the fifth house, and give them an extra 5 points just for being bodily in the fifth house. So I'm sure this sounds quite confusing to you, but we're going to go and have a look at Amanda's chart, and we're going to go step by step.
And Nicola, this is a question about a couple of times. What house systems do you use?
Okay, so I use Placidus, but I switch Placidus whole sign in interpretation. But whatever house system you use, so if you use Placidus, then you just you use the degrees. And if you even if you have intercepted houses, and whatever house system you use that. And then, like I said, in further interpretation, I do kind of swing between Placidus and whole sign. But for this particular exercise, we're going to use Placidus.
Thank you.
So looking at Amanda's chart, normally, like I said, we would look straight to the fifth house cusp, and we would say that Venus has everything to say about getting pregnant. So Venus would then be, and we would then look at Venus in her particular dignity, and we would look to aspects to Venus, and we might want to make comments about our thoughts on how likely it was for Amanda to get pregnant based on that. So you see, broadly, if we're looking at that, we go, okay, Venus is in detriment. What does detriment mean? Well, it's not the English interpretation of the word. It just means, as far away from rulership as possible, which means basically in exile, which means out of the mainstream. So you're not you're having experience in pregnancy as sort of as far away from you as possible. So it looks like, okay, there's already an issue. You're going to be having it out of age group, possibly an outlier event, but it could also be that it is that pregnancy is not happening in your physical body. Perhaps fertilization is happening in an IVF petri dish. So there is something about the detrimental quality of the fifth house ruler that we look at. And of course, the square from Saturn is not fantastic either. So, but then we, as modern astrologers, we kind of like, you bump into that, and that's kind of like the most of maybe what you could say. You could maybe dig a little deeper, but that's kind of like a broad brushstroke. But if we take our Almuten of Pregnancy, what we're going to notice is that we've got to take, and remember, we're going back to this list, we're going to take in all of these 7 points, and we're going to say, okay, if we have the ascendant, it doesn't, there we go. If we had the ascendant in Amanda's chart, because looking at Amanda's chart, there's 0 degrees of Aquarius, we're going to write down 0 degrees of Aquarius, and we're going to say, okay, who has dignity or rulership at 0 degrees of Aquarius? Well, Saturn rules Aquarius, so Saturn gets 5 points. If any planet was exalted there, they'd get 4 points. Then if any planet has like the Dorothean triplicities, and we use all 3 of the Dorothean triplicities, because it's an air sign, and because it's a nocturnal chart, we're going to be looking at Jupiter, Mercury, Saturn. And so they each get 3 points for triplicity. And the 0 degrees of Aquarius is in the terms of Mercury, so we get 2 points, and then it's in the face of Venus, so Venus gets 1 point. So we just fill out that little line like that, and we're going to do it with all of these. So if we go to the next step down, the ruler of the ascendant is Saturn, and Saturn is here at 18 degrees of Capricorn. So we know Saturn has rulership in Capricorn, gets another 5 points. Mars is exalted in Capricorn, gets 4. Because it's an earth sign, it's part of the earth triplicities, which is Venus, Mars, Moon. They all get 3 points. It's in the terms of Venus, so Venus gets 2, and it's in the face of Mars, so Mars gets 1. If we go to the next step, we're going to go here, and we're going to see that we're talking about the moon now. So we've got the moon is at 17 degrees of Aquarius. We can see the moon over here, 17 degrees of Aquarius. We have who has dignity there? Saturn gets 5. It's in an air sign, so we get the airy triplicities of Saturn, Mercury, Jupiter, and we get the it's in the terms of Jupiter and the face of Mercury. And so we go through basically through each and every line of, and each and every point we fill out this table again and again in this fashion, and you'll start to see that certain planets are starting to like hold a little bit of sway over here. We're getting down to the 5th house cusp, which is 25 degrees of Taurus. We're going through the same story again. And as you can see, Saturn scores badly here, but it's only because, you know, Venus is in rulership here. The triplicities are all Earth, so Saturn skips out there. But we're still counting. We're still going through, and we here at the ruler of the 5th is at Venus at in Aries. We're taking all of those dignities into consideration. The position of Jupiter, we take the position of Jupiter into consideration. Jupiter's at 3 degrees of Capricorn. And are we looking to see, are there any planets in the 5th house? There are no planets in the 5th house. So nobody gets a score. And if we total all of those up, what we will see is that Saturn is actually the Almuten of pregnancy by quite a long shot. Now, I know that a lot of you are probably feeling that sinking feeling like, oh no, who wants Saturn as the Almuten of pregnancy? Because Saturn is our traditional malefic planet. But I want to say to you that if we know that we only have 2 malefic planets, Mars and Saturn, this is traditional rules, who can do damage to you, or who can by transit or profection or in some other interpretation cause your pregnancy harm, if Saturn becomes the Almuten of pregnancy, then we want Saturn everywhere in the chart. We want Saturn in the 5th house. We want Saturn on the ascendant by transit. We want Saturn to be highlighted in a profection. Saturn changes complexion. It now becomes a desired planet. We really want to see that Saturn. And likewise with Mars. So people tend to double their chances or opportunity in a chart. They tend to get more opportunity, which is not to say that they're definitely going to get pregnant. They just get more opportunity because Saturn is gone now. Instead of being a malefic, it now becomes something that we want in the
couple
chart.
of questions here, if you don't mind.
Yes, go.
Do we have the rules somewhere? Points, are they the same as Horary?
How do you mean are they're the same as Horary?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that question. Let's go on to the next one.
Is this about the points that you've allocated for each of the planets, or whether it's in rulership or dignity?
This is a natal chart. So we are looking at a natal chart, and we are assessing the dignity of all of these points in the chart as to how well dignified they are at these points, and then we add them up. And so then we're deciding who has the highest score at all of these 7 points. And these 7 points all have to do with getting pregnant. But this is very clearly, it's a natal chart. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Thank you. And another one here. What if a planet that is the Almuten is only a few points ahead of another? How is that interpreted?
Okay, so this is a good question. It happens. I mean, it happens actually quite often that you get a planet with a tie. So often you can get Mars and you can get Jupiter as the Almuten of pregnancy, in which case it kind of tends to be more reflective of the life that is lived. So one thing for sort of is quite certain is that fertility isn't static, and fertility changes, because we might marry this chap and we might have 2 children, then we might divorce, we might marry again, we might have another 3 children or no children, or so there's the chart almost reflects that. So if we get 2 Almutens of pregnancy, there's a very strong likelihood we're going to have 2 separate pregnancy situations, and then it is given to you in the moment to decide which one are we dealing with. Just because it's Jupiter doesn't mean that Jupiter is going to be the stronger Almuten. But you do have to cast your eye around the chart to see if there's any planet in the 5th house. So very often that can be the tiebreaker and give you an answer as to one or the other. And sometimes, yeah, it can happen. Like I said, you can have a tie. You will see though that we're using the Almuten of pregnancy with profection. So again, even if you have 2 Almutens of pregnancy, they very often mirror one another. So they will kind of describe the same situation, or else they'll just give you 2 opportunities or more to be triggered by profection in any given year, or over 2 years. You just get more opportunity that way. Does that answer that question adequately?
Thank you.
Okay. So these are the triplicity rulers that we use just to refresh ourselves. And these are the Egyptian terms that we use just to remind ourselves that we're using Egyptian and not Ptolemy's terms. I say this because we actually you can calculate or get your Solar Fire software to calculate the Almuten of pregnancy, and it can do everything. It just can't tell you about the planet in the 5th house. So I tend to print out my charts. It tells me who's the Almuten of pregnancy, and then I just have to check the 5th house for myself, but that's an easy enough calculation. So right now I'm just going to pause, and I'm going to ask again, are we all kind of now familiar with how the Almuten of pregnancy is calculated, and can we go on to a more in-depth study of Lyndall's chart? Yes?
I'll take one more question. For planets in the 5th house, I presume we calculate them in the same way, going through domicile, exaltation, triplicity, terms, and base?
No. If a planet is bodily in the 5th house, they just get 5 points straight up. It's as if they have rulership because they are in that house. So they get 5 points. We don't have to look at their degree. We just say you get an extra 5 points just for being there.
Thank you. Another couple here. How do you use the 5th house cusp if you are using whole sign?
That's why I don't use whole sign.
That answers that. And do you need to know the ascendant degree?
You do. So anybody's chart that is not an accurately timed chart is a bit of a problem. However, because I'm always doing 2 people's charts, sometimes 3 or more, depending, one person's chart is always quite well timed. So, or most often, so I'll use the person whose chart is better timed.
And maybe
Yes.
one more as we go along
Yes.
here. Does the North Node in the 5th house also get 5 points?
No. Visible planets, the old 7 visible planets, according to Omar. But if you wanted to create your own Almuten of pregnancy, you're very welcome to add asteroids and whatever you would like to add.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on. Let's see it in action. Let's see how it really works for people. And it's as we know, astrology is very interpretative. So it's kind of like everything is always a bit of a judgment, and it's judged in a context, and it's judged in a context of a story. And I think it's always important to remember that it's always based in a story. So here is Lyndall Stolz. And you can see from Solar Fire, the dignity and Almuten scores. The Almuten of pregnancy is Mars, and it is Mars by quite a bit. If we look in the 5th house, we see that Mars is actually in the 5th house. So Mars would get an additional 5 planets. So Venus can never ever catch up. We could add 5 points, but Mars actually wins because Mars is actually bodily in the 5th house. So yeah, we look at that and we go, oh, yay, because Mars is in rulership. So now what we want to do is we now want to find out how strong are her chances of getting pregnant, and how strong is her Almuten of pregnancy, and how is she most likely going to get pregnant? And if she gets pregnant, what is her experience of getting pregnant? Because now Mars has everything to say about getting pregnant. So we're looking at Mars and we're going, yay, it's in rulership, which is great. But look here, we've got Saturn. Saturn is with Mars. So the first thing we want to go is, okay, delays. There might be obstacles. There might be, this is going to hold her back in some way. It's not, this is not a good sign. And then if we stretch this further, because like I said, sometimes I can go sort of between Placidus and whole sign. I don't either like the fact that Pluto is just joining this little threesome over here, sort of straddling the 5th house cusp, and kind of, it's got implications I don't like. So I look at that and I go, okay, this is astrologically just tricky in itself. Now let's start to kind of unpack like the other things we know about normal and regular astrology. So in my astrology, Mercury is very often a signifier for the fallopian tubes. And not because it's like the road that is traveled, but it's more like because Mercury is actually the facilitator of the cosmic marriage, because the egg and the sperm meet in the fallopian tube first. The sperm goes up through the cervix and actually goes into the fallopian tube where it meets the egg that's come from the ovary. Fertilization and the first formation of the embryo happens in the fallopian tubes, and then it travels back down into the uterus where it gets implanted. And that's called conception. So if those tubes are very, very tiny, but they are quite bendy. That's why this is that typical mercurial kind of thing. They are quite bendy. And they've got tiny little hairs in the tubes. And they have to bring this little precious embryo back down into the uterus. But so wherever you get, if this is Mercury and you get an opposition to Saturn, we're going to get, this is a, and to Pluto, this whole like little grouping here, we're going to get a blockage and we're going to get some trauma to those tubes. So I can say immediately, oops, this is a problem. This is a tube problem, and until we sort that out, this speaks of a laparoscopy, but it also speaks of blockages in the tube or something where it's not working properly. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that if you go to my book, I do have a chapter on general signatures. So we can look at the general signatures in the chart, and what we see is, and I do use wide whole sign aspects, but we see that there's a wide square from Venus to Neptune. This is always a hormonal imbalance. And by imbalance, I mean that somebody's hormonal range is out of whack with the normal kind of regulation. So it's where somebody's is not producing enough estrogen or not producing enough progesterone. We don't quite know what it is just yet, but we just know that something is not going to be quite straightforward. I wouldn't normally take in such a wide square if it weren't for the fact that she is a Taurian sun. So the Taurian sun signs as a whole do have, if they're going to have issues with fertility, and bearing in mind most people who come to me are already having issues, so I can already make an assumption that we can broadly say I'm looking for things that are wrong. I'm not looking for things that are right in the chart. So I can say that the Taurians are suffer the most from hormonal variances in their cycle. And very often their bodies can be very stubborn, and they can have a 90-day cycle, or they can have cycles that are too short. They can have the luteal phase that is not long enough. And so because this is all ruled by Taurus, and Mercury in Taurus in particular also has association with the thyroid, and the thyroid governs not only the growth of the sex hormones from the pituitary gland, but it's also the endocrine system as a whole. So that's quite a strong marker. So like I said, that's why I'm considering this wide square.
We do have a couple of questions on retrogrades, and how do you consider and interpret those?
Well, it's difficult. It depends. I'm quite a visual astrologer, so I do like sort of fixed stars, and I subscribe to sort of like using the 7 planets because they are visible. So a retrograde planet in the sky might actually shine brighter because of the retrograde action. And so the retrograde action is not necessarily seen as more negative. It is sometimes seen as just the planet is its emphasis. The planet is shining brighter. So it's just something that you go, oh, okay, I need to take that into consideration. If it's a fast-moving planet, like this is quite fast-moving, so I would consider this combust. So I'm looking at this and I'm going, yeah, okay, that's very definitely combust. It's going, it's not going to slip away, put it this way. But I wouldn't generally say, like, for instance, that because the Almuten of Pregnancy is retrograde, that makes it more negative. I would say that it's just there for emphasis, rather. Does that answer her question?
I think so. Thank you very much.
Great. So and likewise, the moon moves very fast. So I do look at the square to Uranus, this moon square Uranus over here, And because Uranus is so by Placidus, and even though there's an intercepted house here, it is in the 6th. We can drag it into the 7th, but it's very much this is kind of somebody who's the moon is the eggs in the chart, and the eggs are disassociated, if you like. So it's like, oh, okay, so in this disassociation, are we talking about IVF here? This planet Uranus is very much a planetary marker for medical technologies and science and IVF and operations and procedures and things like that. So when I do see that, I'm going, okay, I'm paying attention to that. It's interesting that it falls in the 6th, because I'm also saying, okay, so what? And if you can see from here, it's also conjunct the South Node. So she has a South Node in the 6th. I'm thinking, okay, this could be because of the square here. It could be that there is some kind of issue to do with her health and having children. So I'm now looking at that. This to me would also be a marker and a caution for health having children because of Saturn and Pluto. If Saturn and Pluto weren't here, but Mars was the Almuten of pregnancy and it had good aspects to everything else, I wouldn't be concerned at all. But the fact that Mars, the Almuten of pregnancy, is affected by these two malefic planets. Yes, and I know that this is an outer planet, but they do come into play, as you can see. But I still would consider this more challenging for the pregnancy when and if it does happen. So if we look at her Lyndall's kind of description, and this is what her medical records show, that she had low AMH reading for her age of 27. So that means that this AMH reading is a hormonal reading. So basically, she is heading into what we call sort of low ovarian reserve at a very, very low, at a very young age. At 27, that shouldn't be happening at all. Her FSH was also too high, and her cycle was very short. So the FSH is a follicle stimulating hormone. And when it is high, it means that it's not going to be making enough eggs. And her cycle is too short, which means that she's also low in progesterone. So her the luteal phase is also too short, so she's not producing enough progesterone in order to sustain a pregnancy, even if one were to happen. So this is this hormonal thing that is like, well out of range. And then to make matters worse, when they went to investigate one of her fallopian tubes was lazy, and one of her ovaries was, to quote the specialist, a raisin. So we are talking about somebody who at the age of 27 has got very limited chances of getting pregnant naturally. So, I mean, I could go further and say, look, she's got a Gemini ascendant, and that's the physical body or the uterus. So the lining of the uterus is also under question because it's an air sign, a barren sign. And so sometimes the ascendant could be, the lining of the uterus could be too thin or have something wrong with it. And I'm also not loving this Neptune right opposite the ascendant. There's something that we can't figure out. There's something that is unseen or that is not entirely visible, but is affecting her the lining of the uterus. This could be, we back at the hormonal issues, because the follicle stimulating hormone also makes the lining of the uterus thick. So if we have a lack of that, then we've got to be back to a thin lining, which is of course no good for implantation. So that's just like a broad, and we could sit and nitpick this chart for a little while longer, but I'm more interested in getting into the predictive things. But this is just kind of how I'd go, okay, like a flashcard thing. This is what we're looking at in terms of her fertility. So I also just want to start introducing the story of Lyndall and Dennis. Lyndall is a sister of Raylene and Jacques. And Raylene and Jacques' charts are handled in my book. And what's really interesting is that Raylene and Jacques suffered infertility, and they had 7 IVFs, and eventually they came to me and they had triplets, and then they had another baby boy that was born completely and entirely naturally. And by the time Lyndall came to me, she said, we are also having fertility issues now, and I really want you to do for me what you did for my sister Raylene. And I nearly burst into tears with the stress of it, because you understand that they have a full appreciation of what fertility issues mean, but it's kind of like you're going, oh no, this is like this is performance anxiety. I can't repeat that. So I want you to understand that when I was doing this interpretation, I was extremely nervous, very anxious, and thinking I'm never actually going to be able to repeat another triplets, let alone one in the sister of somebody that had recently got pregnant with triplets. So the other thing I want to just draw your attention to is these are fairly new. So these are the triplicity phase rulerships. And this is like Guido Bonatti used to practice this. So, and Ptolemy to some extent, although Ptolemy used to look at the main luminaries, but Guido Bonatti, who kind of grew up in the plague in Italy, he had a clear understanding that your physical environment had a huge influence on how successful you were going to be in life in general. So what he would do is he would direct your ascendant according to the triplicities that rule all the air signs, and each one of these planets would have a say-so about the stages of your life. So he would say, okay, first I'll use the Alcockadon and I'll calculate the length of your life, and then I'm going to divide your life into 3, and the first third of your life is ruled by Saturn, the second is by Mercury, and the third is ruled by Jupiter. So we'll look at them in the chart and we'll say, okay, what kind of flavor is your personal physical health and your environment going to be during these particular phases. So at 27, we can confidently say that Lyndall is in the second phase of her life. And so we are looking at Mercury, the condition of Mercury. So we look at Mercury combust the sun opposite Pluto. We're going, oh, okay, this is not a really this is not a fantastic phase of her life. So and it seems to imply like quite a bit of stress, and it seems to involve, as I said, the 5th house cusp and having children. So that's kind of very visible in the triplicity rulership of her ascendant. I take this concept a little bit further. So in my fertility, and this, I'm still experimenting with it, even though it's 15 years later, I still call it an experiment because I don't know how to make sense of it. But I think we all have our own sort of internal. So we've got our life, which is we work out through the Alcockadon, and then we can get a very clear, these are the thirds of your life. But our fertility life is probably from the onset of menses until we are 50 years old. And I say 50 years old because most clinics will not take you after the age of 50. And when I say most, I'm talking mostly in the UK and mostly in America. There are other clinics elsewhere that will take you after 50, but not often. So we're dealing with sort of somewhere between 14 and 50, and we have to figure out which is your first, and then, so I always think that from 14 until 27 is actually the first phase of your fertility life. In fact, 26 is kind of for me like the edges, and then from 26 through to sort of 40 is your 38-40 is the next phase of your fertility life, and then from 38-40 to 50 is the last phase of your fertility life. So again, I was going to put Lyndall here at Mars. So we're looking at Mercury and we're looking at the condition of Mars. So if we look at the triplicity phase rulership for the Almuten of pregnancy, and we say, okay, where are you now? We're looking again at Mars conjunct Saturn and Pluto. So we don't even need to we can say opposite Mercury and Sun, but we don't even need to say that. We can just go, it's going to be a hard time having children. This part of your fertility phase is a hard time having children. But when we are making predictions in the second phase of her life, we want to see that the phase rulership of her Almuten of pregnancy is going to be is indicated here, because this is the Almuten of pregnancy. So she was not going to get pregnant necessarily that easily in the first phase of her life, because Venus was the Almuten of pregnancy. But she's more likely to get pregnant in the second phase of her fertility life with Mars. However, Mars is conjunct Saturn and Pluto. So this kind of goes, yes, more likely, and this tells you how it's going to plan out. Does anybody have a question now before I go on to Dennis's chart?
Not sure on this particular one. We had one from before asking, how do you interpret when the Almuten of pregnancy is within an intercepted sign?
Well, then, okay, so we do have a sort of an issue here with Lyndall's chart. Is that clear? This is by a whole sign, not the 5th house. It should be the 6th house, but we still read it as the 5th in like reading it now in the 5th. When we do perfect it, we have to drag it into this is the 6th house, and that's the 7th. If it is in the interceptor, what we can say is that it's going to be hidden, or it's going to be a lot harder to achieve because it's more, it implies that it's very much more hidden. It's almost inaccessible, and you're going to have to, reach for it. That's how I would play it out. And then I would, again, you have to take that into consideration when you're doing profections and make sure that you actually are predicting in the right profection. It gets a bit tricky. You'll see. Going on to Dennis's chart. Let me go and see if I can. We go to Dennis now, and this is as a couple. I mean, you've got to pay attention with astrology because they're born days apart in the same year. So they're going to have the same, and this is a very interesting example to pick because of this. They're going to have the same transits, and they're going to have the same planetary sort of lineup, if you like. So coincidentally, Dennis's Almuten of Pregnancy is Mars. He doesn't have any planet in the 5th house, so nobody can pip Mars. So it's clearly going to be Mars. So we look at the condition of Mars, and while Lyndall's Mars was in the 5th house, and therefore, or the 6th, if you want to even talk whole sign, therefore not angular. In fact, hers was going succeeding to cadent. We now have Dennis's one, which is Mars in the 7th house. It's very clearly sort of in the 7th house. And so it's very much more, it's angular. It's got more power to act, if you like. So that's the first thing that struck me about his is, funny, it's got more power to act, but we've got to notice that Mars is conjunct Saturn and Pluto. When we have a man with Mars, so like we were talking about the moon in women, and the moon is woman's eggs, it's sometimes their uterus, and it's the ability to produce eggs. When we're looking at Mars in a man's chart, this is very definitely the condition of the sperm. So we've got Mars in rulership, which is going, okay, this is quite good, but it's conjunct Saturn, and Pluto gets dragged into that conjunction as well. So I'm looking at this, I'm going, that sperm, it doesn't feel great to me. I'm not happy with the sperm. And then also we've got this, so men don't have fallopian tubes, but they have what we call the vas deferens, which is the tiny tube that actually takes the seminal fluid that has got the sperm, the DNA matter, where it takes it from the testicles, where it joins another seminal tract with the rest of the ejaculate. And sometimes there can be a little hernia in that, and doctors have to go in and do a small procedure, and it's like, honestly, takes 20 minutes to do, but it is a procedure that once they do it, things do improve dramatically. But this is I mean, Mercury is for men the vast difference, and here the Mercury is opposite Pluto. So I'm looking at that and I'm going, okay, maybe this is an issue. The reason why we haven't, we've got issues with the sperm is because we're going to have a varicocele or hernia operation. Again, he's also got the Venus square this Neptune. So in men, this is very much also the sex growth hormones, and that can affect chromosomal integrity in sperm. So we look at his medical history, which is he had very bad morphology, which is the shape of the sperm, and his motility was low. So where we've got Saturn with Mars, that's more of a motility issue. The morphology, I think, is more the Pluto. And I mean, listen to this description that he gave me. All of them had double heads and swam in circles. So that's kind of very much like, I think this is the chromosomal fragmentation issue over there. But he had lots. So this is the Mars in rulership almost. He had lots, and then the count was great. And he also had a varicocele operation. So there's medical confirmation for that, that little hernia that he had in his vas deferens. Okay, let's look at his triplicity phase rulerships. So of his ascendant, his life in general is going to be Venus, Moon, Mars, because he's got an ascendant in Taurus. So we go to the earthly triplicities, and because it's a diurnal chart, we're going to go Venus, Moon, Mars. The triplicity, so we're looking at Mars. For him, he's definitely in the second phase of his life, and he's cuspy, but I think it's second. The triplicity of his Almuten of Pregnancy is going to be Venus, Mars, Moon, because it's in a water sign and it's diurnal, so it changes over. So Venus, Mars, Moon. So the Almuten of Pregnancy, as you can see, is actually also in the second phase of his fertility life. So maybe not so easy for them to get pregnant when when he's in his first phase of life, but it's going to be easier in the second, because the second is ruled by the Almuten of Pregnancy. So a lot of focus here, a lot of focus on the second part of life. So they were both, when I first met them, they were actually 26 and a half, 27. I met them in 12. And very clearly in the first phase of their fertility life, both of them. And we discussed a lot of timing. I mean, I did look ahead and I looked at profections and I just thought it's going to be difficult. So I said to them, you are most likely to get pregnant in 2014, which was 2 years away. And that's devastating news when you've been trying for 2 years already and you desperately want to get your family started. And you're already aware that you've got all of these medical issues. It feels quite bleak. But I said to both of them, particularly Dennis, I said, listen, I know you're an Aries and you're going to be impatient and you're not going to be able to wait. So we can look at times that are maybes, but I'm not promising anything because it's just not the right time. So of course, off they went and they decided to do an IVF on the 15th of April in 2013. So you'll notice by the age here that this is Lyndall's chart. She's 28 years old. So I think we're just cuspy. We've just moved into the second phase rulership of her life. I've picked out some really nice solar arcs that I like. And because they're solar arcs, obviously they hold for very long. So it means that you've got 1 week before and 3 weeks after as kind of like a window to use. You've got iffy little transits here. There's not a lot going on. And when I would have preferred her, if she was going to have her treatment, to have it around January, but they couldn't get the act together and they said, no, they were going to go in April. So it's not for me to tell them when, but I just said, I'm not so sure about this because I don't like Saturn conjunct the 5th house. Saturn is not the Almuten of pregnancy. So Saturn can only cause trouble. And especially if it's in the very month that you're actually having the IVF. So that was obviously, as the title will indicate, a failed IVF. So what did that chart look like by transit? Firstly, it was a perfected 6th house, but it's not this 6th house. We're looking at this because this is this is actually it's a Mars perfection because of this intercepted house Leo. We've got to count all the way around there. So this becomes the 6th house. So we're looking at the where is Mars in the transit chart and what can Mars bring to the table? So that's now the most important thing, is what does Mars bring to the table? Mars is here in rulership in Aries, but it's at 26 degrees. It's combust the sun in transit and it's also void of course. So it's kind of like, it's one of those kind of like, it's just not the right time. We've got Uranus like right on the midheaven. So this is like IVF time. This is the timing of when she's having the IVF is like spot on. It's like, yes, you're having it. And this is going to be not upsetting the family, but this starts to rock the family tree a little bit or to shake the family tree. But it's just, this doesn't have the potential to kind of unlock anything. And we've got no other fantastic transits. We've got Jupiter opposite this Uranus, but this is all cadent. So this is not, this didn't really speak to me. This Neptune here on the moon, people often ask, can Neptune stop a pregnancy? What's going on when Neptune is on the moon? If somebody's having IVF treatment and they're taking a huge amount of hormones, then the Neptune becomes benign in a way because it merely describes the taking of the hormones. If they're not and they're trying naturally, then I would be more concerned that there was some kind of hormonal or endocrine issue that was stopping them from getting pregnant. But if it's merely the fact that they are having IVF treatment, then I kind of have to ignore the Neptune for a bit. Then the next thing is that after that failed IVF, which I said probably wouldn't work, they came back and said, when next can we have IVF? And because now I'd asked them technically to almost wait 2 years. So I said, because Mars is your Almuten of pregnancy, this seemed to be the only, like I was saying, we've got to be very wise being fertility astrologers. Firstly, you've got to, you're working with doctors, you're working with people's lives. They're spending £4,000 or £5,000 at a time, or quite a few $1,000s at a time to do these treatments. Astrology isn't yet an accepted or regulated science. So we can't say to people, you'll definitely get pregnant. There are no guarantees. And because astrology was not, how can I say, astrology was described and written up, and the tradition of astrology is so old, astrology itself does not have anything to say about IVF or modern treatments. So it's often the case that medical science can trump the astrology only because astrology has had no particular tradition or being able to describe IVF. So we have to reserve the space that medical science can sometimes outperform the astrology. So sometimes, especially when somebody is waiting to have children and they're desperate, it would be unethical of me or anybody else to tell them to wait unnecessarily. So when you see something that's like a little bit of a tickle, and this could be whatever, that's when I said, if you want to and you have the resources, you could try. But I was conscious always that we're back here with Saturn conjunct the fifth house cusp. It's just the same as April. In fact, this whole year of 2013 was Saturn conjunct her fifth house cusp. So I said, I'm not 100% certain, but you can try. So she went in July and it failed. What did that chart look like? So now we are looking at the Almuten of Pregnancy, which is Mars, and we are looking at, it's a sixth house, even though it's still the Mars that rules it. I'm just trying to describe that it's a sixth house profection here. And so we must look at the transits of Mars, and what is Mars doing? It's making an absolutely tight exact opposition to Neptune in the first house. So this is also kind of very this is a very undermining, if you like, signature. And there isn't a lot. The North Node, I mean, it is eclipsing the Saturn over here, but there's nothing. Saturn here is threatening this fifth house cusp, but there's nothing else that's giving us any relief. And whichever way we look, this Mars profection is still stuck with Saturn and Pluto in it, and we can't seem to get rid of that. My only hope was to say to her, wait until you're out of that profession and we're going to do a seventh house profession, because then we can start relying on your husband's chart. The two charts can then work together, because you're both going to be doing a seventh house profection, and there's more opportunity for both of your charts to be working together. But we also then slip out of this Mars rulership and we go straight into a Jupiter rulership. And although Jupiter is in fall in Capricorn, it still has to give. It gives less, but it still gives. So my hope was like hanging on to that perfection, if you like. So finally, after many attempts, or the two other attempts, Lyndall decides to go. We picked a time where, firstly, we've got a very lovely solar arc. Plus, we've just changed perfection. Can you see she's gone from 29 to 30, literally in this week. She had her IVF on the 25th of April, so somewhere just in between here, as she turned 30. And this is what a successful one looked like. And by transit, Jupiter is here trining the Almuten of Pregnancy. So I always like to see sort of just afterwards, when is, like, what is the story happening? Like, is there anything afterwards that is going to impede it? The one thing that I do want to say is that normally I would not advise somebody to have, sorry, and here's Jupiter also trining a planet in the fifth, which is also for me a good sign. I would normally not advise people to have a treatment so close to an eclipse, or just before an eclipse. But to have one on an eclipse, you kind of like, you almost past it. So it's, if somebody were getting pregnant sort of in March, might have a bit of a problem, because this eclipse might get in the way. But because this eclipse is kind of like at the same time, it's not part of the picture. But I do want to just make a note, is that the eclipse is exactly conjunct the 11th house cusp on the day of the profection change, i.e. her birthday. I mean, this is her chart. So this is a chart of the successful IVF treatment. What we have here is we've got Mars, which is now at 12 degrees of Libra, quite angular. It's exactly opposite Uranus. So this is describing, okay, this is like our surgery, and it is squaring this Jupiter, the ruler of this perfected year. So the Almuten of Pregnancy comes to the perfected ruler, describing how it's going to happen. And even though we've got Saturn, which is retrograding back from Mars, so Saturn is slightly going further away from Mars, so it's not applying to Mars, and it's not going to get there quickly anyway. We look at this and we go, okay, so maybe we've got a lucky window and and we've also got a bit of a Jupiter return happening here. And there's also a trine. So we've got this trine from Jupiter to the Saturn-Mars conjunction. But the Saturn is still here, so we must pay attention to this. So this is describing sort of, this is not going to be an easy pregnancy. And we know that with IVF, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's not straightforward, but more about that later, but still got an eye on Saturn. Is there somebody who has a question now before we go and have a look at Dennis's chart?
Yes, we have a couple here. Someone is asking, is it possible to find the timing of ovulation even though your period is unstable?
Okay, so if somebody has got a moon Uranus hard aspects, moon Uranus hard aspects, or moon in Aquarius, these people, or moon in Aries sometimes, these people have ovulation cycles where you might bleed regularly every 28 days. But in between those 28 days, your ovulation is a little bit irregular. So you can one day ovulate, 1 month you'll ovulate on day 9, the next month you'll ovulate on day 16. So if you were trying naturally, you might miss those things altogether. So I always advise people with those kinds of moons to get a proper ovulation tracker, where you either testing with temperature or basal temperature or ferning often, and you can track your ovulation more correctly with that. Some women can go through a month and they don't ovulate at all. It just depends. So there is a bit of a fallacy that we ovulate every month. It's also a bit of a myth that we all ovulate on day 14, although that's most common. And so I hope that answers that lady's question.
Thank you. A couple more coming through here. What orbs do you use for aspects? I think that was a question from earlier on.
So I use moiety. So if a planet is an outer planet, they've got kind of like a bigger orb. I also use the whole sign tradition is also like there are whole sign aspects. So you can say that once a planet is, but I tend to use those when the planet is applying and the planet is moving faster than the stationary planet. Then I'll say, okay, fine. I can look at that as a transit. What I've noticed is that if you put yourself in the position of a visual astrologer, i.e. your little astrologer, like at the top of some tower in Mesopotamia somewhere, looking out at the night sky, it's very hard to be exact about where degrees start and where they stop. So it tends to be like more using whole sign and whole sign aspects. So I wander into, I don't want to get into an argument about orb, but I'm just saying I mostly use moiety.
Thank you. And we'll just get through these last couple of ones here before we move on. Are you using whole sign for perfections or still using quadrant house system to determine perfected signs?
Again, so you'll notice in the way that I use the perfections before, even though the previous year is indicated by Placidus as Sagittarius, I use it as Scorpio so I revert to whole sign when I do perfection.
Okay, thank you. Is it a good year to get pregnant when you have a lunar eclipse at your birthday? It could be an auspicious year for something related to having children, and especially if the moon is the Almuten of pregnancy, or if the moon is an aspect to the Almuten of pregnancy, or by perfection the moon is suddenly highlighted, but not generally. I tend to think that eclipses are kind of for royalty unless they are hitting an exact degree in the chart. So I kind of go, don't pay too much attention to them, except if they happen between 6 and 8 weeks after you are having an IVF treatment. So the heartbeat comes in between 6 and 8 weeks. And there has been some debate. I think Aristotle said that the heartbeat comes in for women, for girl babies at 40 days and comes in at day 60 for male children. And so I think what happens if we're taking Aristotle, and he probably believed in the Platonic principle that we descend through all the spheres of the planets and then we get deposited on the earth with the new moon and the full moon. What we are talking about is a bunch of souls that then get together, they all get on a bus, and when we have an eclipse, we have like the bus crashes, if you like. So I kind of I feel like an eclipse between 6 and 8 weeks after you're having an IVF cycle is problematic, wherever that eclipse is. I just try and avoid them if I can. But I would have to see that person's chart further to qualify that answer.
Thank you very much. And lastly, do you use the natal lunar phase returns?
No. I would strongly recommend that they belong in horary astrology, because the theory is very elegant, and the theory is kind of we're using it as a divinatory method. I have tried to apply the Jonas method to all of my charts, and they don't work. And the problem with the Jonas method of repeating your lunar phase and using that as a timing mechanism, the one thing you'll work out pretty quickly when you have got fertility clients who are doing fertility treatments, and that is you will not find a laboratory on this planet that is going to allow you to pick the time on a particular day that you have a particular treatment. So you have to use timing mechanisms that actually don't involve timing related to the moon or timing that is to a particular day. You'll notice that I focus on solar arcs, and I increase my use of solar arcs because they give you a bigger window of time to use. So a solar arc is quite out there, and it's quite manifest, and it's sort of hot to trot a week before and 3 weeks after, which gives you 4 weeks of a window in which to schedule your egg transfer or your embryo transfer, and that is acceptable and manageable by a clinic or at a clinic. But any other timing that is quicker than that is just causes your client much more stress, and you're never going to get it right. There's too many things go wrong. So no, the lunar phase method doesn't work for me.
Thank you. And can I just add, if you're putting questions in the Q&A, please keep them as succinct as possible and not have multiple questions in one go. Thank you very much, and thank you for answering those.
Okay, so yeah, so that was kind of Lyndall's journey. Let's look at what was happening in Dennis's chart. So at the same time, so here in the first failed IVF, he was a 28. So we're even talking about a Libra profection, which was before even his Mars profection, if you like. The thing that was most striking is that here they're doing the failed IVF. Lovely transits, all very descriptive of IVF. Yes, Jupiter to Uranus, and this Jupiter to Moon Uranus, all in the 7th, and Jupiter sextile Venus in the 11th. This is very much these are positive markers, and ordinarily they would be fantastic on their own. But we've got the solar arc here hovering, this Neptune square the sun. And we all know that Neptune can bring huge amounts of like unforeseen problems, but it's a grief marker essentially. It's a slow, degrading planetary signature that sometimes just is foggy and sometimes does not leave you with anything in your hand. So looking at that, I was not overly confident, but also bear in mind, this is 2013. They were desperate to start. I was kind of hoping that this maybe was going to be a granny in the family that maybe passed on, maybe, a family dog, perhaps also crossing the rainbow bridge. And maybe this was going to be the grief marker. So we want to try and contextualize it. If he had said, and sadly, nobody was passing on. If somebody says, yes, my parents are actually, dying of cancer, or this is terminal, whatever, then I go, okay, well, maybe that's what's happening there, and this could be still positive. So again, it's all about finding out all the stories that are playing out in their lives so that you can try and make sense of their transit. But because nobody else was compromised, I kind of didn't really have much hope. But remember, Dennis is the Aries. He was very impatient to get on with his treatment. This is what his chart looked like for the failed thing. So he's in a I think in this particular chart, he's got a Libra profection, and he is, so we have to look at Libra, and Libra's here opposite in like 1 degree. So you remember Lyndall's chart was also that she had that Mars at 1 degree of opposite, at 1 degree of Cancer opposite that Neptune at 1 degree, very, very tight. So this kind of, I was going, no, this is awful. But again, they're trying, and they want to make it happen. So, but that wasn't very hopeful for me. The next failed IVF was the 15th of July. So
nice transits here, getting warmed up nicely, but no solar arcs. I don't see a single solar arc that has any meaning here. There's particularly nothing going on here. And this is when they had the failed IVF in July. If we look at the chart on the exact date, again, we're going to look to his Almuten Of Pregnancy as Mars, and we're going to look to the Mars, and Mars is opposite Neptune. So like right in that 1 degree. So we're going, well, that's not really, fantastic. Then if we look to his final, the successful IVF triplets, which resulted in the triplets that they had it on the 25th of April. So we're talking around about here, but over here, he's just changed from his changed profection. So he's changed profection ruler. So now all of a sudden he goes to a Mars profection. And things suddenly unlock. So suddenly he gets a solar arc here, which is quite nice. He gets this Uranus opposite conjunct his Venus in the 11th house, which is quite a strong marker for IVFs. This is a very strong marker for IVF. So that all looked, and this would also cover. So this solar arc would also cover for the rest of April. What it looked like in the chart is that we've now got the perfected ruler is Mars. And don't forget, this is in it's the second triplicity phase ruler of his Almuten Of Pregnancy. Plus, he's now got this Mars is opposite a planet in the 11th house. So this is his wife's 5th house, his derived 5th house. So this is really important that we've got a planet that's opposite by transit. And it picks up another. This is a transit to, again, Uranus to Venus, but it's this kind of in the sky. We've got Saturn is here, so I'm still anxious, but this looks, and Venus is about to go into the 11th house. So this still looks the dispositive Venus, the dispositive Mars. So this still looks like much, much, much more promising. So what I wanted to just say was when I looked at the charts, going further, I did notice that, and I see that I didn't include it for some reason, that I did notice that they had there was a transit of Saturn actually was going to conjunct this Mars. And because it's in the 7th house, I just said to them as a couple, I counseled them as a couple, I said, look, this is part of the story of your pregnancy, but when Saturn comes to this Mars, you're going to be 30 weeks pregnant, which is not nearly cooked enough. 40 weeks is a pregnancy. You're going to be 30 weeks. And when Saturn comes to Mars, it's like a confinement. So I want to just warn you that at this point, I want you to be as near as possible to your hospital. Do not go away on holiday. Don't plan anything. Just this is, potentially like a bit of a drama. And because you'll be 30 weeks and it's triplets, there's a lot that can go wrong. And as it happened on exactly that date that I said, Lyndall had to go into hospital and she had to have the triplets prematurely. What happened thereafter sort of really described her natal chart, because what happened thereafter was she nearly lost her life due to she hemorrhaged very, very badly. When they take the placentas away, there's very little left of her uterus, really. And so she went into cardiac arrest and needed to be resuscitated several times. She had 3 of these tiny little preemie babies, and one of whom then got also a terrible sepsis infection and had to stay in the hospital for an additional month. So that was like really very, very difficult and traumatic. So I think this describes all of that. This just describes, like, yes, because we're in rulership, but there's going to be a lot of trouble and trauma, and that ended up being the trouble and trauma. And again, this is kind of dragged into the 6th house if we go whole sign. So it kind of indicates that this is not good for Lyndall's health either, that, with a severe sort of 6th house event. And there is the end of my slide presentation. So I hope you have enjoyed understanding that there were sort of, I think it was broadly three predictions that were correct, 4 if you count the hospital date, but triplets for Lyndall, and they're now 7 years old and they're lovely. And we can see how perfection is all important in triggering the Almuten Of Pregnancy, that it's not necessarily going to get triggered unless it's a a year that is where the perfected ruler is well aspected, and the transiting Almuten of pregnancy is also well aspected and can actually have access to the chart. And if there are any further questions, I'd love to take them.
Wow, thank you so much. What a fascinating presentation. Absolutely incredible. Let's see any last questions coming up here. One from before, do you round up for degrees in the calculation of Almuten?
No, we don't round up, no.
Okay. What is the success rate for predicting successful pregnancies?
Gosh, so the trick is, or the thing to understand is that not everybody who comes to see me, I don't give them a pregnancy test, and they don't often tell me, they don't come back to me and say, yes, I am pregnant, or no, I'm not pregnant. So I don't get the feedback that I need from my client base in order to answer that question adequately. Furthermore, the people that come to me are people who are terrified of doctors and who don't like Western modern medicine. And so they have shied away from doctors. They usually come to me too late, and they usually do have profound issues. So I do tend to see the problem children of the fertility world, which is also difficult. So most of my time, I'm just affirming to people why they have been unable to get pregnant and why they are possibly still unable to get pregnant. The way in which I prefer to phrase it is that I'm probably 75 to 80% accurate in what I tell people. So my ability to spot things in the chart as to all reasons why you're not getting pregnant, my ability to spot good times or bad times is probably 75 to 80%, but I don't have any data that could ever possibly support that.
Well, you are very popular. You're blowing up our chat. Do you give any more classes specifically on fertility astrology? Any for practicing astrologers? Any more educational programs?
I am actually in the process of creating an online webinar lecture material, so about potentially 5 to 8 hours worth of teaching. And then I would like to consider offering a mentorship course, one-on-one, possibly, yeah, with an accreditation at the end of it. But this is all sort of still in the process. I'm going to be doing it with Jen's art, and so it'll come out of Kaylee, and yeah, I'm hopefully going to be doing that in the next couple of months.
Wonderful. Hopefully a workshop with Kepler too. We'll see. Donna's here as well. For regular pregnancies, what do you say about eclipses for getting pregnant? Did you answer that one before?
I did. The short answer is generally I avoid them.
Okay. Can you speak a bit on hard aspects between the moon and Neptune?
Okay, Moon and Neptune is very often also it's the a thyroid issue. So it can be thyroid Hashimoto's, it can be hormonal fluctuations that are well out of the range of normal. But it also is the worst interpretation of hard aspects. Moon Neptune is chromosomal integrity issues in both men and women. So these are people that probably need donor material. But they only need donor material, or should consider donor material, if they've tried more than 3 IVFs and they have had potentially nice looking embryos with no implantation. So, and I think we have got a fair amount of technology now. We've got pre-genetic testing. So I think that anybody who is doing IVF, if you do have a Moon Neptune hard aspect, just sign up for the pre-genetic testing. It's more expensive, but you get to the answer sooner than later.
And some more questions. Fascinating with your work. Do you get a lot of clients over the age of 45?
I do. I get an extraordinary amount of older people. And I think the reason is because the medical profession doesn't really want to see them, because they don't want to kind of sully their success rates or their figures. So they traditionally don't like women over 42. So they most often come to me. I do work with a lot of doctors in the world. So I do pass people on to my favorite doctors who will treat women who are over that age. I do find it more and more common that, you know, that women are obviously coming later in the day for fertility treatment. I mean, it takes longer to get yourself financially secure. It takes longer to possibly find yourself the, you know, Mr. Right, and or the person with whom you want to have children. And yeah, sometimes it's just hard to schedule your life and fit it all in. So yes, people are arriving later.
We have a couple of questions on how to find you. So any social media sites, or I know you have your YouTube and your website too. Oh, you got the screen. Wonderful.
There you go. This is just the YouTube. So I have a channel with all the YouTube material on there. It's not a lot, but I think the testimonies are rather lovely to watch.
Wonderful. And you actually, we could speak about your application that you have. We have a question here asking about your pregnancy app. Will it be available in Australia?
I'm not. It should be. It should be. I've just recently changed the app, so I apologize deeply. It's taken longer than you think. It always takes longer than you think. So I know people have been trying to access it because I did announce it earlier that the app was going to be ready. I've dropped the questionnaire part in front of the app, so the app's going to be much quicker. It's going to be, hello, how's it, your birth date, your time, and then you're going to get your results page. We had a few issues, I think 4 days ago, but they have been sorted. And it should be available in Australia on both platforms, but I will double check with my developers and get back to you.
Thank you. Curious on your thoughts when your pregnancy, Almuten, is also your chart ruler.
Well, that you could just say, okay, fairly strong chance, that looks good. But what if, so I have I've looked at those all of those Almutens, and there are some Almutens that are pretty like nerve-wracking. There's one called the killing planet. So I have seen somebody's chart where the Almuten of pregnancy was the killing planet as well, and it was in the 5th house. And this particular lady she had tried for 17 years. That's 17. That's a long time. She tried for 17 years to have a baby. Eventually she got pregnant. And at 5 months she had gone, okay, she wasn't always that keen on the medical fraternity, but at 5 months she'd gone to have some tests done. They found out that the child was severely compromised. And at 5 months she actually had to have a stillbirth. She had to, stop the pregnancy. So there's an interesting kind of interpretation of when the Almuten of pregnancy is also the killing planet. And then after that, she then had another pregnancy, sort of about 7 months after that, the loss of that first baby. And then after the second baby was born and was fine and everything was perfectly healthy, a year after that, she developed breast cancer. So. But she was quite old. She was 44 when she was having the second baby. And for some women, that extra estrogen in the system can trigger certain types of breast cancers. So it's kind of like that Almuten of pregnancy wasn't it being also the killing planet was not great. So yes, you are right to look at, are there any crossovers? Are there any Venn diagrams? Which planets rule what? I think it's a very important exercise to do.
Thank you. And I'm just going to take these last couple of questions because we're nearly coming to the end of time. Is there a beneficial time for younger women to harvest her eggs for later?
I think it is beneficial for younger women to harvest their eggs. I would say age 26 is probably appropriate, or if you. Depending on when you in particular want to become a mum. And it's I think having a fertility check in terms of your hormone profile at about 20 is not bad. So you could go to your gynae or your female wellness center, what have you, and ask for a fertility screening for your hormones so that you are properly appraised as to how your system is working. Do you have any thyroid issues? And these things can be treated quite quickly and efficiently and not become part of a fertility profile later.
Thank you. I'm going to take these last 3 questions. Could I please ask your thoughts on the Moon-Mars conjunctions?
Okay, the Moon-Mars conjunctions in females is mostly women who have middle month pain. So it's mostly women who have a tendency towards ovarian cysts, which means if you have a tendency towards ovarian cysts, it means that there's maybe too little progesterone in the luteal phase, which doesn't release the egg follicle. So what happens is that the egg follicle doesn't burst and it just keeps filling up with fluid, and that causes the pain. So it forms part of a bigger profile of polycystic ovarian syndrome at some stage, but you'd need other tick boxes to confirm that. So there's that's Mars Moon, just in the ovarian thing. But then also Mars Moon is people who need ICSI or who need maybe forced fertilization for those same reasons. So that is when you have IVF, instead of just putting the sperm in the dish and letting the sperm find the egg and self-fertilize, which sometimes they like to do because that's nature's way of selecting, if you like, they sometimes like to put the sperm through an injection needle right into the egg. And so that's very often Moon Mars. That's ICSI. And also Moon Mars is surgery to the breast, surgery to the abdomen. So we're looking for breast augmentation, we're looking for mini facelifts, we're looking for surgery to the eyes. It covers quite a lot, but that's just in women. In men, Moon Mars is morphology issues. That's the shape of the sperm.
Thank you.
So,
and last two questions. Which dignity was 4 points?
Exaltation.
Okay. And lastly, is there any particular things in a chart that would indicate ongoing miscarriages?
Yeah, Saturn, Neptune. So, I've now been doing this for 20 years, and what's really interesting is how every generation comes with its own thing. So I've been I've now done with the Pluto in Virgo, Pluto Uranus conjunction in Virgo. They were all the tubes. So initially everything about fertility treatments was all tube related. And they tried lots of things, Zift, Gift, and all sorts of things, all to do with the tubes. And eventually they decided, no, we don't need the tubes. You'll just go straight for IVF and bypass the tubes altogether. Then we had the Pluto in Libra generation. They're all endometriosis and adenomyosis and fibroids in the uterus, which is a comment actually on the skill at our new technology at picking up those polyps and things that are in the uterus, that our scanning equipment is just so much better than it was before, because people still got pregnant with the same kind of issues, but we just weren't focusing on them. But I just find that interesting that that's now become a common a diagnosis. But the Saturn Neptune lot, both of them, the 89 and the 79, or the 78 lot, they're interesting because it's like if you bring Saturn Neptune together, you get like something is trying to manifest, but there's something that's stopping it manifesting. So this is the miscarriage kind of theme, if you like. But it's also people who are going to be challenging and undermining boundaries and authority figures and what have you. So this is also the LGBTQ kind of generation. So I'm finding a lot of my LGBTQ people have got Saturn Neptune. And I think it's because they're dissolving the boundaries between gender. They're dissolving the boundaries between sort of informed, like what it is to be a parent, who's going to be a parent, and all of those boundaries. But at the same time, it actually could also be that there is an inability to manifest it in the way that you want. So that would be like one of my worrisome markers, is that if Saturn was your Almuten of pregnancy and it was square Neptune, I would be concerned.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for such an insightful and fascinating presentation. And I just want to iterate for those who maybe came late or had issues with audio, this recording will be out on our YouTube channel. So again, go to YouTube, type in Kepler College, you should be able to find us. And I'm hoping to get this video up tomorrow afternoon, Eastern time, so you can rewatch this fascinating webinar. And again, Nicola, we wish to thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. And I'm sorry I couldn't get to every question. We've got hundreds of people attending today, so we couldn't get to everyone, but thank you for answering the questions too.
Thank you. It's been lovely to chat to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Thank yous here. Wonderful. So many questions. People were fascinating.
That's great.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody.